Hi, I'm Miss Pliskin, and today I'm building a not at all historically accurate Hanging Gardens of Babylon. This build is completely out of my comfort zone for a couple of reasons. One issue being that I pretty much had to make the whole thing up from scratch because there's no archaeological information on how the gardens looked. And the second issue is this debug waterfall. I've never used any of the debug waterfalls before, and I struggled quite a bit to incorporate this thing into the build so that it looked like an aqueduct. I've seen a number of tutorials on how to use these, and they all rely heavily on rocks and plants to blend the waterfall into the surroundings. The issue here building an aqueduct is that I can't use any of those tips. So what I ended up doing was building up a stepped platform just to the underside of the falls, and then later on filling in the steps with some blocks that came from the Get Together expansion pack, those wall ruin pieces. And sizing those down and staggering them across the platform made the stepped platform less noticeable and made it look kind of more like a sloped canal. I used them again to sort of camouflage the end of the waterfall that drops off into the pool. Another thing I do to make that bit look a little better is later on I add rows of those water spray features to make it look like a little mini waterfall into the pool. I seriously cut out so much struggling to try to get this aqueduct to work. I almost cut it out completely, but it's kind of a big deal. The Roman aqueducts get a lot of hype, and for good reason. Roman public works in general were crazy impressive. I am a huge fan of water-related infrastructure, but these aqueducts were built 5 centuries, 500 years before the Roman aqueducts. It's an amazing engineering marvel, so I had to include them. And after all that struggle on the aqueducts, I end up deleting half of it because it was taking up too much space on the lot. But oh well, that's how it goes sometimes. I'd rather have a bit more space for the actual buildings and, the garden. So a bit about the real-life Hanging Gardens of Babylon. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon was described by contemporaries as an extensive, decorative, terraced walled garden. Authors described buildings that look like mountains. Gardens were said to have had terraces built on pillars, hence the name Hanging Gardens, with a complex irrigation system fed by aqueducts and canals built to carry water from the mountains 30 miles away. Except there's just one problem with all those accounts. There has been no archaeological evidence for anything, even remotely similar to this, ever found in the area where Babylon used to exist. And even more confusing, no Babylonian sources that mention the gardens, which is super disappointing. However, these gardens were so famous with ancient writers, very widely written about, with very specific details given. So what gives? Well, during the same time period that these Babylonian gardens were purported to exist during the 6th century BC, just a mere 300 miles away was an amazingly similar Assyrian garden complex of largely the same description. These Assyrian gardens had complex irrigation with massive aqueducts, every type of fruit tree, tame lions, parrots, mountainous terraced gardens, all surrounded by heavily fortified walls. Sound familiar? Perhaps just a coincidence? Both the Babylonian and the Assyrian city the garden was located in had the same nickname, Gate of the Gods, which is kind of weird, but apparently a few cities at that time had that nickname. Come on, guys, be original. So maybe, visitors just got confused. They thought they were in Babylon's version of Gate of the Gods when they were actually in Assyrian's version of Gate of the Gods. Maybe they wrote to their friends back home, "Hey, Babylon's doing awesome things with plants over here." Long story short, now the gardens are recorded as being Babylonian. Alternatively, historians might have just had some translation issues along the way. Who knows? Another odd note that makes historians wonder about the validity of these fantastical gardens actually being in Babylon is the ancient Greek historian Herodotus traveled to Babylon in the 5th century BC, during the time the gardens would have existed, and in his writings on the city, he never mentioned any fancy schmancy gardens. Which is super weird. Why would he not mention the main tourist attraction? Though, this is the same dude that visited Giza and never mentioned the Sphinx. So I think he probably just wasn't cut out to be a travel writer. Ultimately, a lot of historians agree that it's completely plausible that the Hanging Gardens of Babylon were actually Assyrian. All that backstory out of the way, let me tell you why it doesn't matter, sort of. Babylon and Assyria were both in modern-day Iraq, and I've got limited options to recreate an ancient Middle Eastern building style. Since there aren't a lot of Middle Eastern architecture elements in The Sims, let alone ancient Babylonian or Assyrian. My solution is to use a combination of elements from the Courtyard Oasis kit, which has a more Moroccan flair, but that's the best I can do. And more importantly, I used Felix Sanders' Grove custom content set. This set is rustic Mediterranean inspired without the Roman or Greek aesthetic, and I was really trying to avoid accidentally making this look like Greek temples with all these columns. If anything, the Assyrian aesthetic looks a lot like ancient Egyptian in a lot of respects. The Met Museum in New York has a great room reconstruction of an Assyrian palace, and I took basically no inspiration from that at all, but it's great anyway, you should absolutely visit it. But yeah, since I couldn't reproduce that style of architecture, I much preferred to lean into a Middle Eastern flair to reflect its location in modern-day Iraq. Right now, I'm wrapping up the building portion, and wow, I used a lot of those archway column pieces from Felix Sanders' Grove set. Sheesh! But I love how the plaster texture looks on those, and I like how none of my rooms are actually indoors. I wanted all the indoor spaces to feel like indoor-outdoor spaces, very breezy and open. Chilly desert nights might get a bit tricky to deal with, but in reality, it'll be summer days in The Sims that'll kill you. No AC here. Oh, and I forgot to mention, I've classified this lot as a park, I think, or a state park, national park, I don't know, some sort of park. So it'll be a community lot, which I basically never build, but it seemed right for the Hanging Gardens to be a public space. And what was I gonna do, hide a bedroom somewhere? That'd be weird. The landscaping was, shockingly, a huge part of this build, and the landscaping items from Jungle Adventure do a lot of heavy lifting here. I kind of went back and forth on what kind of plants I should have in this garden, but since Jungle Adventure comes with all those hanging plants, I kind of had to go in that direction. I decided the front of the build would have a sort of native species of desert plant vibe, but once you're inside the garden gates, it's no holds barred, lush tropical jungle. I had no idea where to start with landscaping this place at first. I ended up using my usual shortcut of placing all the larger plants first, starting with the trees, and then just seeing where that took me. I love the look of these organized rows of palm trees along the walkways, so I repeated that a few times in the front and along the back and also between the buildings. After the tree placement, I went for the native desert plants out front. My thought process here was that the plants out front wouldn't get spared much water, and the real feast for the eyes would be behind the gates. I'm landscaping inside the gates now, and I tried to make each little area of landscaping feel almost out of control with ivy and vines. Like I said, I used a lot of Jungle Adventure, especially those hanging plants, but I also used quite a bit of plants from Island Living. The little patches of chunky grass worked really well to transition from leafy trees and bushes to sand. And wow, these hanging plants, I thought I was going to be hanging these plants until the end of time. Ultimately, it has such a nice effect though, especially at a distance. These vines do a lot to communicate that this is a lush oasis in the desert. Oh, and another nice little trick for hanging plants is to place these low-lying bushes on top of the walkways so you get a nice archway of greenery effect. I did that basically everywhere I had an outdoor walkway around these buildings. I created these narrow canals using the pool tool all over the place, the thought being that the aqueduct would carry water to the main canal, and then there'd be a bunch of canals branching off to carry water all throughout the lot. For all those little canals, I added a ton of lily pads. I might have gone a little bit overboard on the lily pads. I just really wanted a ton of plant life everywhere, so not even the pools were safe. I really didn't like how the empty pools looked so blank and bland. Kind of sad, I may have gone in the extreme other direction though. Mixed in with the lily pads, I added the floating lily candle lights, which are so cute, and I basically never get an opportunity to use them, so I also went way overboard with those. They're such a niche item though. I feel like a lot of super cute items in The Sims are like that. I love them, but when am I ever going to use them? And most of the time it's probably a swatch issue. And don't even get me started on how much I miss the Create-A-Style tool. Okay, almost went on a rant there, but I stopped myself. Back to the build. For the garden decor, I really wanted to incorporate a lot of water features. And you might be thinking fountains shooting jets of water into the air is way too modern, but actually a lot of ancient engineers understood hydraulics enough to get incredibly clever with fountains. Decorative fountains have been around since at least 2000 BC in their simplest form. The Assyrians used gravity and small channels to generate water pressure to feed water into fountains decorated with stone-carved animal heads. The Greeks later invented a type of water pump called an Archimedes screw, where basically you have an inclined pipe with a tight-fitting screw inside. The lower half of the pipe is submerged in water, and as the screw turns, the water gets carried up the pipe by the blades of the screw. This was one way that water could be elevated in order to generate the water pressure required for a fountain. The Romans were able to make fountains with water jets since at least the 1st century BC, so basically, if we're going to make a garden to impress ancient civilizations enough in order for them to slap on the Ancient Wonder of the World label, we're going to need fountains. And even though the Archimedes screw is attributed to Archimedes, it could very well have been much, much older than that, and could have been the exact way that water was supplied to the upper terraces of the hanging gardens. I am so curious what this place would have looked like in real life. Ancient Wonder of the World? It's a pretty big title to live up to. I mean, let's compare it to the other 7 wonders of the ancient world. You've got the Great Pyramid of Giza. Okay, obviously that's amazing. A garden competing with that? It's gotta be pretty good. Then you've got the Colossus of Rhodes, a gigantic statue that loomed over the bay of the Greek city of Rhodes. It was almost 110 feet tall, which doesn't sound that big, but in ancient times, anything that tall that was man-made must have been mind-blowing. And that poor dude only lasted like 50 years before an earthquake took him out. Super lame. Then you've got the Lighthouse of Alexandria, which I like that this one is actually a practical feat of engineering and not just essentially decoration. I like functionality. There's also the Temple of Artemis. It was said that the sun had never looked upon anything so grand. And ooh, this one's got a good story. So this temple had a bit of a hard time of things. It was destroyed and rebuilt 3 times over the centuries. It just could not catch a break. About 600 years after the final time it was rebuilt, it was ultimately destroyed by the Christians. But the second time this temple was destroyed, it was an act of arson by a man named Herostratus. And I cringe even saying his name because he destroyed the temple in order to get famous. His punishment was death and to be erased from history. His name was supposed to never be mentioned again, never connected to his crime in order to deny him the satisfaction of living on in infamy. Of course, that is a very unsatisfying ending for historians, so naturally we know his name now. But what a jerk though, right? Next up on the list is giant statue of Zeus at Olympia, another Greek statue. This one was only 43 feet tall though. And last but not least, yet another Greek construction, a huge mausoleum. The mausoleum at Halicarnassus, yet another ancient wonder of the world, ultimately destroyed by earthquakes. But hey, as a lasting legacy, it's where we get the word mausoleum from. So anyway, all that to say, the Hanging Gardens have some seriously stiff competition. I'm not entirely sure that my particular version would have made the cut, but oh well, I tried. Alright, so the competition is stiff. What the heck am I doing about it? I wanted each little sitting area to feel very luxurious. Well, ancient luxurious anyway. In order to try to make up for the fact that I've got limitations on the lot size and limitations on the architecture style and limitations on the number of stories I can build and yada yada yada. I mean, you know the drill when it comes to building in The Sims. Word of the day is limitations. But I tried to make it feel very much like an oasis in the desert, with water features and fountains in most of the spaces, and drapey fabrics and cushy pillows. I really wanted it to feel like if you took your sim to this lot, you could almost imagine someone feeding them grapes and fanning them with a palm frond. I set up the actual buildings to be mostly lounging areas. I wanted this to be the ultimate spa-like getaway, without actually being a spa, of course, because I had no idea how I would have incorporated the spa lot type requirements and still made this look halfway authentic. Without any spa stuff, we've just got the atmosphere. And speaking of atmosphere, I used so many hanging lanterns in this build. At night, it is so pretty, it looks almost magical. I used the hanging lanterns from the Courtyard Oasis kit a lot, and also, weirdly enough, some of the hanging lights from Batuu. But mostly, I used the lanterns from Felix Anders' Grove set. The lanterns that come with that set are a bit more simple and look like they could fit really well with an ancient aesthetic. Here you can see me wrapping up another lounge area, but lounge space wasn't the only thing I included, despite what it may seem like so far. I wanted this lot to be at least somewhat usable, so I have a room with a bubble blower in it, but hookahs weren't invented until around about the mid-1500s, so, only about 2,000 years after the Hanging Gardens existed. And yet again, we have thoroughly established that there is no historical accuracy here. But I had to put something else to do on this lot other than lounge around and swim, which are awesome pastimes, don't get me wrong. But Sims get bored. The other thing I added was an eating area. I added a grill and a dining table, since a grill is a requirement for a national park. The national park requirements are so funny. Literally just picnic table, grill, trash can. Not even a bathroom. No bathroom required. Fear not, I did put a couple of bathrooms on the lot anyway, because I am a rebel who is apparently really into historical inaccuracies today. We're coming up to the end of the build, but stick around to the very end for some glamour shots. I hope you liked this build. It was kind of a weird one for me, and let me know in the comments if you have any building or architecture style requests. If you're interested in art, architecture, and history, please consider subscribing. I have many more of these videos planned, and thank you so much for watching.